The city of Lagos glittered under the golden glow of the evening sun. From the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the tallest building on Victoria Island, the view looked almost unreal. Endless streams of traffic crawled along the highways below, horns blaring faintly in the distance. The Atlantic Ocean stretched toward the horizon, reflecting the dying sunlight like molten gold. Inside the penthouse office at the very top of the building sat Adrian Okoye. At 32 years old, Adrian was already a legend in the business world. He was the founder and CEO of Okoye Global Holdings, a multinational empire that controlled real estate, tech investments, oil logistics, and luxury hotels across 3 continents. Magazines often called him Africa's youngest self-made billionaire. People admired him, people feared him, but very few people truly knew him. Adrian leaned back in his chair and loosened his tie, staring thoughtfully at the city below. His office was enormous, decorated with modern art pieces worth millions. A rare Italian marble desk stood in the center of the room, surrounded by leather chairs imported from London. Yet despite the wealth surrounding him, Adrian felt strangely empty. His phone buzzed on the desk. The name flashing on the screen was Vanessa. A small smile touched his lips as he answered the call. "Hey," he said. Her cheerful voice flowed through the speaker. "Adrian, are you still at work?" "Yes, just finishing up." "You promised you wouldn't work too late today," she teased. "Remember, we're meeting the wedding planner tonight." Adrian chuckled softly. "I remember." The word wedding still felt new to him. Just 2 weeks earlier, Adrian had proposed to Vanessa during a romantic dinner at a luxury restaurant overlooking the ocean. The ring he gave her had cost more than most people's houses. A flawless diamond. Vanessa had cried tears of joy. She had thrown her arms around him and said yes immediately. At least, that was what Adrian wanted to believe. "Adrian," Vanessa's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Yes, you're quiet. Just tired," he replied. "Well, hurry home," she said sweetly. "Your fiancé misses you." The call ended a moment later. Adrian slowly placed the phone back on the desk. Then his smile faded. Something deep inside him felt uneasy. For weeks now, a quiet voice in his mind had been asking a question he could not ignore. Does Vanessa love me, or my money? Adrian had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Investors wanted his approval. Politicians wanted his support. Women wanted his wealth. He had dated many women over the years, models, socialites, actresses, but every relationship had ended the same way. Once money entered the picture, love disappeared. But Vanessa had seemed different. She was beautiful, elegant, and confident. When they first met at a charity gala 2 years ago, she hadn't appeared impressed by his wealth at all. Or so he thought. Adrian stood up from his chair and walked toward the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Tall, handsome, powerful, and incredibly alone. Behind him, the office door opened. "Sir." Adrian turned around. Standing at the door was Samuel, his longtime assistant and the only employee Adrian trusted completely. Samuel had worked with Adrian for nearly 10 years. He was calm, intelligent, and brutally honest when necessary. "Yes?" Adrian asked. Samuel stepped inside holding a tablet. "The board meeting summary you requested," he said. Adrian accepted the tablet but didn't look at it. Instead, he studied Samuel thoughtfully. "Let me ask you something," Adrian said suddenly. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerous." Adrian chuckled faintly. "Be honest. When am I ever not?" Adrian leaned against the desk. "Do you think Vanessa loves me?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. He was the kind of man who chose his words carefully. "That's a complicated question," he said finally. Adrian crossed his arms. "Try." Samuel sighed. "Sir, I've seen many people come into your life, and most of them liked your lifestyle more than they liked you." Adrian's expression hardened slightly. "And Vanessa?" Samuel hesitated again. "She enjoys the lifestyle as well." The room fell silent. Adrian already knew that, but hearing it out loud still stung. Samuel continued carefully. "I'm not saying she doesn't love you, but," Adrian pressed, "but you have never given anyone the chance to love you without your money." Adrian frowned. "What do you mean?" Samuel placed the tablet down on the desk. "Every woman who meets you already knows who you are. They know you're rich. They know you're powerful." He looked directly at Adrian. "So how would you ever know if they love you, or the billionaire?" Adrian stared at him. That question echoed loudly in his mind. For the next few minutes, neither man spoke. Finally, Adrian walked back to his chair and sat down slowly. "What if," he said quietly, "I could remove the money from the equation?" Samuel looked confused. "How?" Adrian leaned forward. "What if Vanessa believed I had lost everything?" Samuel blinked. "You mean, pretend to be bankrupt?" Adrian shook his head. "Not just bankrupt." His voice grew colder. "Helpless." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "I don't like where this is going." Adrian stood again and began pacing slowly across the office. "What if I had an accident?" Samuel's expression changed instantly. "No. Just listen." "No, sir," Samuel said firmly. "Whatever you're thinking is a bad idea." Adrian ignored him. "What if the world believed I was paralyzed? My companies temporarily transferred to trustees. My wealth locked up in legal complications." Samuel stared at him. "You want to pretend to be crippled?" "Yes." Samuel rubbed his forehead. "That's insane." Adrian stopped pacing. "Is it?" "Yes," Samuel said bluntly. Adrian walked toward the window again. "Think about it," he said quietly. "If Vanessa truly loves me, she will stay. And if she doesn't?" Samuel asked. Adrian's voice turned cold. "Then I deserve to know before marrying her." Samuel sighed deeply. "Sir, relationships shouldn't be tested like business deals." Adrian turned around slowly. "My entire life has been business deals." Samuel had no answer for that. Adrian returned to his desk and sat down. "I've already spoken to a private medical consultant," he continued. Samuel's eyes widened. "You've planned this already?" "Yes." "How long?" 3 weeks. Samuel looked stunned. Adrian leaned back in his chair. "The accident will happen in 2 days." Samuel stared at him in disbelief. "You're serious?" "Completely." The room fell silent again. Finally Samuel spoke quietly. "And what happens after the accident?" Adrian's voice was calm. "I return home in a wheelchair. And we see who Vanessa really is." Samuel shook his head slowly. "This could destroy your relationship." Adrian's expression was unreadable. "Then it was never real to begin with." Samuel studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "I suppose there's no changing your mind." "No." Samuel nodded reluctantly. "Then I'll help manage the business side while the world thinks you're incapacitated." Adrian gave a small smile. "That's why you're the only person I trust." Samuel picked up the tablet again and walked toward the door. But before leaving, he paused. "One more thing." Adrian looked up. "If Vanessa truly loves you." "Yes." "Don't let this test break her heart." Adrian said nothing. After Samuel left, the office became quiet again. Outside, night had fully fallen over Lagos. The city lights sparkled like thousands of tiny stars. Adrian stared at them silently. In 2 days, the world would believe Adrian Okoye was a crippled man who had lost everything. His businesses would appear frozen. His wealth would seem gone. And the woman who claimed to love him would face a life very different from the one she imagined. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. Part of him hoped the test would fail. Because if Vanessa truly loved him, then maybe, just maybe, he could finally believe that love was real. But another part of him, the cautious billionaire who had spent years protecting his heart, needed proof. Proof that someone could love him when the money was gone. When the power disappeared. When all that remained was a man sitting in a wheelchair. Adrian opened his eyes again and stared at the glittering city. "Let's see the truth," he whispered quietly. And with that decision, the most dangerous test of his life had begun. The rain fell softly against the large glass windows of the Okoye mansion as the black SUV slowly drove through the tall iron gates. The once lively estate now looked quiet and strangely heavy, as though the entire house had sensed the tragedy that had happened. Inside the car, Adrian Okoye sat motionless in a wheelchair, staring ahead with an unreadable expression. 3 weeks had passed since the accident. At least that was what the world believed. News channels had broadcast the story endlessly. Billionaire Adrian Okoye paralyzed after horrific crash. Images of the destroyed luxury car had circulated across social media. Commentators debated the future of his companies. Some investors panicked. But Adrian knew the truth. Every single detail had been carefully staged. The accident, the hospital reports, even the emotional press statement released by his company. Everything was part of the test. Beside him in the car sat Vanessa. She wore oversized sunglasses even though the sky was dark with rain. Her perfectly styled hair fell over her shoulders, and she kept checking her phone anxiously. Adrian watched her quietly. In the hospital, Vanessa had been perfect. She had cried at his bedside. She had held his hand and whispered comforting words. She had even refused to leave his room for 2 days. Anyone watching would have believed she was the most devoted fiancée in the world. But Adrian had noticed something else. Something small. Something subtle. Every time a doctor entered the room, Vanessa would ask the same question. Not about Adrian's pain. Not about his recovery. But about how permanent the paralysis was. "How long will this condition last?" she asked once. Another time she whispered to a nurse. "Are there any expensive treatments?" Her tone always carried something strange. Concern, yes, but also calculation. The car finally stopped. The driver quickly got out and opened the door. "Sir, we're home." Adrian nodded. The driver carefully helped him move into the wheelchair before rolling him toward the mansion entrance. The large double doors opened slowly. Inside, the once vibrant house felt unusually empty. Most of the staff had been dismissed after the accident. Adrian had announced that the financial pressure from medical treatments and frozen assets forced him to reduce expenses. Only a few essential workers remained. Vanessa stepped into the house behind him and looked around. She sighed loudly. "This place feels so depressing now." Adrian said nothing. The driver rolled him into the living room. The massive chandelier above them sparkled faintly, but the atmosphere was heavy. Vanessa walked past Adrian and dropped her handbag onto the couch. "I'm exhausted," she said dramatically. Adrian looked at her calmly. "You've barely done anything today." Vanessa frowned slightly. "I spent the entire morning talking to the wedding planner." Adrian studied her face. "About the wedding?" She shrugged. "Well, I had to cancel most of the plans." Adrian felt a quiet sting in his chest. "Because of me?" Vanessa turned toward him. "Well, Adrian, things are different now." She crossed her arms. "You can't walk." The words hung in the air like cold metal. Adrian forced a faint smile. "I noticed." Vanessa sighed again and sat on the couch. "I'm just saying the big beach wedding doesn't really make sense anymore." "What kind of wedding does make sense?" Adrian asked calmly. Vanessa hesitated. "I don't know yet." Her voice lacked the excitement she once had when discussing their future. Adrian noticed. He noticed everything. For the rest of the afternoon, Vanessa stayed glued to her phone, scrolling endlessly through social media while Adrian remained in the wheelchair nearby. Not once did she ask if he needed anything. Not once did she offer to help him move. Eventually Adrian spoke quietly. "Vanessa." "Yes. I'm hungry." She looked up briefly. "Oh." There was a pause. Then she called toward the hallway. "Hello? Is anyone here?" A few seconds later, a young woman appeared. She wore a simple uniform and looked slightly nervous. "Good afternoon, ma'am," she said politely. Vanessa waved her hand dismissively. "Good. You're here." She pointed toward Adrian. "Prepare food for him." The young woman nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Adrian looked at her carefully. He had never seen her before. "Who is she?" he asked. Vanessa replied casually. "Oh right, I hired a new maid yesterday." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "You didn't tell me." Vanessa shrugged. "Well, someone has to help around here." She glanced at Adrian briefly. "And someone has to help take care of you." The words were sharp. The young maid looked uncomfortable. Adrian remained silent. Vanessa stood up and grabbed her handbag again. "I'm going out for a while." Adrian looked surprised. "Where?" "Just meeting friends." "You just got home." "So?" She snapped slightly. Adrian stared at her. "Vanessa, I just came home from the hospital." She sighed loudly. "And what exactly do you want me to do? Sit here and watch you all day?" The words struck harder than she realized. Adrian said nothing. Vanessa rolled her eyes. "I'll be back later." A moment later, the front door slammed shut. The house fell silent. Adrian sat alone in the middle of the living room. The new maid stood awkwardly nearby. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then she stepped forward slowly. "Sir." Adrian looked up. Her voice was soft. "Would you like rice and chicken?" Adrian studied her face. She looked about 25 with kind eyes and a calm expression. "Yes," he said quietly. "Thank you." She nodded gently. "I'll prepare it right away." As she walked toward the kitchen, Adrian leaned back in the wheelchair. His chest felt strangely heavy. This was only the first day at home, and already Vanessa sounded tired of him. 2 hours later the maid returned with a tray. The smell of fresh food filled the room. She carefully placed the tray on the table beside him. "Here you go, sir." Adrian looked at the plate. Rice, grilled chicken, steamed vegetables. It looked simple but well prepared. "Thank you," he said. The maid hesitated. "Would you like help eating?" Adrian looked at her. The test required him to act fully dependent. He sighed softly. "Yes." She gently picked up the spoon and began feeding him slowly. Unlike Vanessa, she didn't rush. She didn't sigh. She didn't look irritated. Instead, she spoke calmly. "My name is Ada, sir." Adrian nodded. "Adrian." She smiled slightly. "I know." They both laughed quietly. After a moment, Ada spoke again. "I'm sorry about your accident." Adrian watched her expression. There was no curiosity in her eyes. No judgment. Only genuine sympathy. "Thank you," he said softly. "You must have been very strong before it happened." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Why do you say that?" Ada continued feeding him. "Because even now you still look strong." Adrian was surprised. "Strong?" She nodded. "Yes." She pointed gently toward his eyes. "Your eyes still look like someone who hasn't given up." Adrian felt something warm in his chest. It had been weeks since anyone spoke to him like that. Not like a burden. Not like a broken man. But like someone still worthy of respect. When the meal ended, Ada carefully cleaned the tray. "Do you need anything else, sir?" Adrian shook his head slowly. "No." She smiled. "Then I'll finish cleaning the kitchen." Before she walked away, Adrian said quietly, "Ada." She turned. "Yes, sir." "Thank you." She looked slightly surprised. Then she nodded gently. "You're welcome." As she disappeared into the hallway, Adrian sat silently in the living room. Outside, the rain had stopped. But inside the house, something had quietly begun to change. Vanessa had once filled this mansion with laughter and excitement. Now her presence felt distant, cold, and strangely impatient. But the quiet maid who had arrived only yesterday had already shown more kindness in a single afternoon than Vanessa had since the accident. Adrian stared at the empty doorway where Ada had disappeared. The test had only just begun. But already, he could feel the first cracks forming in the love he once believed in. Morning sunlight poured gently through the tall windows of the Okoye mansion, casting soft golden beams across the polished marble floors. The house was unusually quiet. Adrian Okoye had always been an early riser. Even during the busiest years of building his business empire, he rarely slept past 6 in the morning. His mind had always been sharpest at dawn. But now, sitting in the wheelchair beside the wide bedroom window, he had been awake since 5. The silence of the house felt strange. Once, this mansion had been full of life. Staff members moved constantly through the hallways. Chefs prepared elaborate breakfasts in the kitchen, and assistants arrived early to discuss the day's meetings. Now everything had changed. The once bustling estate had become quiet and nearly empty. And Adrian was supposed to be a man who had lost almost everything. He stared outside at the gardens. Tall palm trees swayed gently in the morning breeze. The fountain in the center of the courtyard continued its steady rhythm, water cascading into the stone basin below. From a distance, the house still looked like the home of a powerful billionaire. But inside, the atmosphere had shifted. Adrian leaned back slightly in his wheelchair. The test had been underway for 4 days now. For days since he had returned home pretending to be paralyzed. For days since Vanessa had begun slowly revealing a side of herself Adrian had never truly seen before. The hospital version of Vanessa, the caring fiancée who held his hand and cried beside his bed, had begun to disappear. In her place was someone colder, someone impatient, someone who looked at him now not with love, but with frustration. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. A gentle knock followed. "Sir." Adrian turned toward the door. "Come in." The door opened slowly, and Ada stepped inside carrying a small tray. She wore the same simple uniform as always, her hair neatly tied back. Despite the early hour, her face looked bright and alert. "Good morning, sir," she said with a warm smile. Adrian returned the smile. "Good morning, Ada." She walked into the room and placed the tray on the nearby table. "I brought breakfast." Adrian looked at the tray. Oatmeal, fresh fruit, tea. It wasn't the extravagant breakfast he used to have every morning prepared by professional chefs, but something about it felt comforting. Ada noticed his expression and laughed softly. "I know it's simple," she said, But it's healthy. Adrian chuckled. Simple is fine. She hesitated. Would you like help? Adrian nodded. Yes, please. Ada pulled a chair closer and carefully lifted the bowl. She began feeding him slowly, the same way she had done the day before. There was something incredibly calm about the way she moved. No impatience. No discomfort. Just quiet kindness. For a moment they ate in silence. Then Ada spoke. Did you sleep well? Adrian shrugged slightly. Well enough. She studied his face briefly. You look like someone who stayed awake thinking. Adrian raised an eyebrow. You can tell that? She smiled. My grandmother used to say the eyes reveal when the mind refuses to rest. Adrian chuckled softly. She sounds wise. She was, Ada said. Before she died. Adrian's smile faded slightly. I'm sorry. Ada nodded gently. It's all right. She lived a long life. She continued feeding him quietly. After a few minutes Adrian asked, How long have you worked as a maid? Ada paused slightly before answering. About 7 years. Adrian looked surprised. You started very young. I had to, she said simply. What happened? Ada looked down at the bowl briefly before speaking. My parents died when I was 14. Adrian felt a small ache in his chest. Both of them? Yes. She spoke calmly, but her eyes revealed how difficult those memories were. My father was a mechanic. My mother sold food in the market. One year there was a terrible accident on the highway. She stopped for a moment. The bus they were traveling in crashed. Adrian said nothing. Ada continued quietly. My grandmother raised me after that, but she was old and sick. We didn't have much money. So you started working, Adrian said gently. Ada nodded. At first I cleaned houses part-time while still attending school. Did you finish school? Yes. Adrian looked impressed. That must have been difficult. It was, she admitted. But my grandmother always said education was the only thing nobody could steal from you. Adrian leaned back slightly. I like your grandmother. Ada smiled. She would have liked you too. Adrian laughed. I doubt that. Why? Because she would probably say I made too much money. Ada laughed softly. That's possible. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Then Ada suddenly looked embarrassed. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. For what? I'm talking too much. Adrian shook his head. I don't mind. She seemed relieved. Most employers don't like maids talking so much. Adrian raised an eyebrow. You can talk as much as you like. Ada smiled again and continued feeding him. But then Adrian noticed something. You didn't ask about the accident. Ada looked slightly confused. What do you mean? Everyone asks. What happened? Was it painful? Will I ever walk again? Ada thought for a moment. Then she shrugged. I assumed you were probably tired of answering those questions. Adrian stared at her. That's true. So I didn't ask. Her voice was simple, natural. Adrian felt something unexpected inside him. Respect. In all the conversations he had since the accident, people either pitied him or were curious about the details. Ada had done neither. She simply treated him like a person. Not a tragedy. Not a story. Just a man eating breakfast. After finishing the meal, she cleaned the tray carefully. As she stood to leave, Adrian spoke again. Ada. She turned. Yes, sir. Why are you kind to me? The question surprised her. What do you mean? Adrian gestured toward the wheelchair. Most people feel uncomfortable around someone like me. Ada looked confused. Someone like you? A cripple. The word sounded harsh in the quiet room. Ada's expression changed instantly. No. Her voice was firm. You're not a cripple. Adrian raised an eyebrow. Really? You're someone who had an accident. That's different. Adrian studied her face. What if I never walk again? Ada thought for a moment. Then you'll sit. Adrian blinked. That's it. She nodded calmly. Life doesn't end because one thing changes. Her answer surprised him. Adrian had expected sympathy, maybe even pity, but Ada had given him something else entirely. Perspective. She picked up the tray and walked toward the door, but before leaving, she paused. You still have your mind, she said. And your heart. She looked directly at him. Those matter more than legs. Then she left the room. Adrian sat in silence. Her words echoed in his mind long after she was gone. For years Adrian had surrounded himself with powerful people. Executives, investors, politicians. Brilliant people. Ambitious people. But somehow, this quiet maid with a simple life had just spoken the wisest words he had heard in a long time. He slowly turned his wheelchair toward the window again. Outside, the sun had risen higher, filling the gardens with light. But inside Adrian's heart, something unexpected had begun to grow. Not attraction, not yet, but something deeper: admiration, respect, and a quiet curiosity about the woman who had entered his life so quietly. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the house, Vanessa slept peacefully in the master bedroom, unaware that her behavior over the past few days had already begun to change everything. The test Adrian had created was revealing the truth. And slowly, very slowly, the maid who spoke kindly to a crippled billionaire was becoming the most important person in his world. The days following Adrian's return from the hospital passed slowly, like heavy clouds drifting across a quiet sky. Inside the Okoye mansion, the atmosphere had changed completely. Once, laughter had filled the halls. Once, music had played from the living room speakers as Vanessa moved around the house excitedly, discussing wedding decorations and honeymoon destinations. But now the mansion felt strangely cold. Not physically cold, emotionally cold. Adrian noticed the change more and more each day. At first, Vanessa still attempted to behave like the caring fiancée she had been at the hospital. She would occasionally ask if he needed something. She would sometimes sit beside him while scrolling through her phone. But the warmth in her voice had faded. The excitement in her eyes was gone. And most of the time, she simply avoided being in the same room with him. Adrian noticed everything. He was a businessman who had built billion-dollar deals by studying the smallest details in people's behavior. A raised eyebrow, a hesitation in a voice, a shift in tone. All of those things revealed truth. And Vanessa was slowly revealing hers. That evening, a cool breeze drifted through the open balcony doors of the living room. Adrian sat in his wheelchair near the window, quietly watching the sun sink into the distant Lagos skyline. The sky was painted with shades of orange and purple. It should have been a peaceful moment. But inside Adrian's chest, a quiet tension was building. Vanessa had been acting strangely all day. She had spent hours getting dressed, trying on different outfits, fixing her makeup several times, checking herself in the mirror repeatedly. Adrian had watched silently from the couch. Finally, he asked calmly, "Are you going somewhere?" Vanessa barely glanced at him. Maybe, I might meet some friends." Adrian studied her face. "You seem very dressed up for a casual meeting." Vanessa sighed impatiently. "Adrian, not everything I do needs an explanation." Adrian remained silent. The old Vanessa would have laughed. She would have come over, kissed his cheek, and said something playful. But this version of Vanessa was different. She looked at him now like someone who had become an inconvenience. Eventually she grabbed her handbag and walked toward the door. "I won't be late," she said casually. Adrian nodded. "Okay." But she didn't leave. Instead, she hesitated near the door, checking her phone again. Then she smiled at the screen. A different smile. A secret smile. Adrian noticed. She quickly slipped the phone into her purse and walked outside. The door closed behind her. The house fell silent. Adrian remained in the living room for several minutes, staring at the door thoughtfully. Something about her behavior had felt strange. He slowly wheeled himself closer to the window and looked outside. Vanessa's car had not left. It was still parked near the gate. Adrian frowned slightly. Then he heard something. Laughter. Soft laughter coming from outside the house. Adrian leaned forward slightly. The laughter didn't belong to Vanessa alone. There was a man's voice too. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Slowly, he turned his wheelchair and moved toward the hallway. The mansion was large, but Adrian knew every corner of it. He carefully rolled down the hallway until he reached the entrance area. The front door was slightly open. Through the narrow gap, he could hear their voices clearly. Vanessa's voice sounded playful. "You're late." The man laughed. "You missed me?" "Maybe." Adrian's heart beat slowly but steadily. He positioned himself quietly near the wall where they couldn't see him. Then he looked through the small opening. Standing just outside the door was a tall man wearing a stylish black shirt and expensive shoes. He looked confident, relaxed, too relaxed for someone standing at another man's house. Vanessa stood in front of him, smiling brightly. Adrian noticed something immediately. It was the same smile she used to give him. The man leaned closer. "You look beautiful tonight." Vanessa laughed softly. "You say that every time." "Because it's always true." Adrian felt something sharp inside his chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just a deep disappointment slowly forming. Vanessa glanced toward the house. He's inside. The man shrugged. So? Vanessa lowered her voice slightly. He can't walk. The words were quiet, but Adrian heard them clearly. The man smirked. Well, that makes things easier. Vanessa laughed again. Then something happened that made Adrian's stomach twist. She stepped closer to the man. Much closer. Close enough that their bodies almost touched. You're terrible, she whispered playfully. The man leaned forward. You like terrible. And then, he kissed her. Right there. At the entrance of Adrian's home. Vanessa didn't resist. She didn't hesitate. She kissed him back. Slowly. Passionately. Like two people who had done this many times before. Adrian felt the air leave his lungs. The test had been running for less than a week. Less than a week. And already his fiancée was kissing another man. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the location. His house. The house where he had proposed to her. The house where they planned to start their life together. Now it had become the place where she openly cheated on him. The kiss lasted several seconds before Vanessa pulled away. She laughed softly. You're crazy. The man grinned. You love it. Vanessa glanced toward the door again. He's probably sleeping. Adrian remained perfectly still. The man shrugged. Even if he's awake. What's he going to do? Vanessa smiled slightly. Nothing. The word echoed painfully in Adrian's ears. Nothing. To her, he was now nothing. Just a cripple sitting in a wheelchair. The man suddenly wrapped his arm around her waist. Come on, he said. Let's have a drink. Vanessa hesitated briefly. In the house. Why not? She thought for a moment. Then she shrugged. You're right. And with that she pushed the door open. Adrian quickly rolled his wheelchair backward into the hallway, making sure they couldn't see him. A moment later, their voices echoed through the living room. Vanessa's laughter filled the air. The man's voice followed. Adrian remained hidden in the shadow of the hallway. His mind was calm. Too calm. Inside, his heart felt heavy. But his face remained expressionless. Because now, the test was working perfectly. He slowly wheeled himself forward until he could see the living room. Vanessa and the man sat comfortably on the couch. She poured wine into 2 glasses. They clinked their glasses together. To freedom, the man joked. Vanessa laughed. Exactly. Adrian stared at them quietly from the hallway. Every second confirmed what he needed to know. Every smile. Every touch. Every careless word. Finally, the man asked, So what about the wedding? Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically. What wedding? You're engaged, remember? Vanessa took a long sip of wine. That was before the accident. And now, she shrugged. I'm not marrying a cripple. The sentence landed like a hammer. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. The truth was now undeniable. Vanessa had never loved him. She had loved the billionaire. The powerful man who could give her luxury. But the moment she believed he had lost everything, her loyalty vanished. Adrian opened his eyes again. In the living room, Vanessa leaned toward the man and kissed him again. They laughed together like two people celebrating something. Meanwhile, in the hallway, the man they believed powerless sat silently in his wheelchair, watching, learning, and understanding the truth. Because sometimes, the most painful discoveries were also the most necessary ones. The morning after Adrian witnessed Vanessa kissing another man in front of the house felt strangely quiet. The sun rose slowly over Lagos, painting the sky with soft shades of gold and orange. Birds chirped in the distance, and the calm breeze moved gently through the tall palm trees surrounding the Okoye mansion. But inside the house, the atmosphere was heavy. Adrian had not slept. He sat in the living room near the large glass windows, staring out at the garden while the events of the previous night replayed endlessly in his mind. Vanessa's laughter, the stranger's voice, the kiss. Every moment had been burned into his memory. But what surprised Adrian the most was not the betrayal itself. It was how calm he felt. Years of business had taught him to control his emotions. In negotiations worth billions of dollars, anger was a weakness. Emotion clouded judgment. And right now, Adrian needed his mind to remain clear. The test was working. Painful, yes, but necessary. Footsteps approached from the hallway. Ada appeared a moment later carrying a tray. Good morning, sir, she said gently. Adrian turned his wheelchair slightly and forced a small smile. Good morning, Ada. She walked closer and placed the tray on the table beside him. Breakfast is ready. Adrian looked at the tray. Fried eggs, toast, fresh fruit, and a cup of tea. Ada noticed the tired look on his face. Did you sleep well? She asked. Adrian hesitated. Not really. She frowned slightly. Are you feeling pain? Adrian shook his head. No. Ada studied him for a moment. You look like someone who is carrying heavy thoughts. Adrian gave a faint laugh. You're very observant. Ada smiled softly. My grandmother used to say the face always reveals what the heart tries to hide. Adrian looked away toward the window. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. Ada picked up the spoon and began feeding him carefully. Unlike Vanessa, she never rushed through the process. Every movement was patient and gentle. For a moment they ate in silence. Then Ada spoke again. Sir. Yes. If something is troubling you, you can talk about it. Adrian glanced at her. Why would you think something is troubling me? Ada shrugged lightly. You've been staring outside for a long time. Adrian smiled faintly. Maybe I just enjoy the view. Ada laughed softly. Maybe. But she didn't press further. She simply continued feeding him quietly. Adrian appreciated that. Most people were either too curious or too distant. Ada seemed to understand the balance between caring and respecting someone's privacy. After breakfast, she wiped his hands with a warm cloth. Would you like to go outside today? She asked. Adrian shook his head. No. All right. She collected the tray and stood up. I'll finish cleaning the kitchen. Before she left, Adrian said quietly, Thank you, Ada. She smiled warmly. You're welcome, sir. As she disappeared down the hallway, Adrian leaned back in the wheelchair again. The peaceful moment didn't last long. About 30 minutes later, loud music suddenly echoed through the house. Adrian frowned. The sound was coming from the living room speakers. Moments later, Vanessa walked down the stairs wearing a tight red dress. She looked glamorous, like someone preparing for a party, not someone living with an injured fiancé. She barely acknowledged Adrian as she walked past him toward the mirror. Adrian watched silently. You're up early, he said calmly. Vanessa rolled her eyes slightly. I couldn't sleep. She adjusted her hair in the mirror. Why is the music so loud? Adrian asked. I like music in the morning. Adrian didn't argue, but something about her behavior felt different today. More careless, more bold. Then suddenly the doorbell rang. Vanessa's face brightened immediately. She rushed toward the door. Adrian's heart sank slightly. He already knew who it was. The door opened. The same man from the night before walked in confidently. Tall, stylish, smiling like he belonged there. Good morning, the man said casually. Vanessa laughed. You're early. I couldn't wait to see you. Adrian watched quietly from his wheelchair. Vanessa didn't even bother introducing the man. She simply walked over and hugged him. Right there in the living room. Right in front of Adrian. The man glanced briefly toward Adrian. His eyes scanned the wheelchair. Then he smirked slightly. So this is him? Vanessa shrugged casually. Yes. Adrian felt the insult like a slap. Not even a name. Just him. The man walked closer and sat comfortably on the couch. Vanessa sat beside him. So what's your name? The man asked Adrian with a mocking tone. Adrian looked at him calmly. Adrian. The man nodded slowly. I'm Kelvin. He leaned back on the couch like a king visiting a conquered palace. Vanessa laughed softly beside him. Kelvin glanced again at Adrian's wheelchair. So the famous billionaire, he said sarcastically. Vanessa rolled her eyes. He used to be. Both of them laughed. The sound echoed painfully in Adrian's ears. But Adrian remained silent. Kelvin leaned closer to Vanessa and whispered something in her ear. She giggled like a teenager. Then Kelvin turned back toward Adrian. You know, he said casually, life is funny. Adrian said nothing. One day you're rich and powerful, Kelvin continued, and the next day you're stuck in a wheelchair. Vanessa nodded dramatically. Exactly. She looked directly at Adrian. It's depressing. Adrian stared at them quietly. Kelvin suddenly stood up. Well, enough sad talk. He grabbed Vanessa's hand. Let's get something to drink. They walked toward the kitchen together, laughing. As they passed Adrian, Kelvin looked down at him. Don't worry, he said casually. We'll try not to make too much noise. Vanessa laughed loudly. Adrian felt his hands tighten slightly on the armrest of the wheelchair. But he remained calm. because every cruel word only confirmed what he needed to know. A few minutes later, Ada walked into the living room carrying a cleaning basket. She immediately sensed the strange atmosphere. Her eyes moved from Adrian to the empty couch, then toward the kitchen where laughter echoed loudly. "Sir?" she asked quietly. "Are you all right?" Adrian forced a small smile. "I'm fine." Ada looked uncertain. Then she noticed Kelvin and Vanessa returning from the kitchen with drinks. Kelvin had his arm wrapped around Vanessa's waist. Ada's eyes widened slightly. She quickly lowered her gaze and continued cleaning. Vanessa noticed her. "Ada," she called. "Yes, ma'am." "Bring us some snacks." "Yes, ma'am." Ada walked toward the kitchen. As she passed Adrian, she whispered softly, "Do you need anything?" Adrian shook his head. "No," but Ada's eyes showed concern. She had seen enough to understand what was happening. Back in the living room, Kelvin sat beside Vanessa again. They leaned close together, laughing, whispering, touching each other openly. Sometimes Kelvin even glanced toward Adrian with a mocking smile, as if daring him to react. But Adrian didn't move. He simply watched, because the more cruel they became, the clearer the truth became. And the truth was this: Vanessa had never loved him. She had loved the billionaire, not the man. And now that she believed the billionaire was gone, her mask had fallen completely. Meanwhile, across the room, Ada returned quietly with a tray of snacks. She placed it gently on the table. But as she walked away, her eyes met Adrian's briefly. And in that silent moment, Adrian saw something Vanessa had never shown him: compassion, respect, and quiet understanding. The test was far from over. But one thing had already become painfully clear. The woman he planned to marry was capable of shocking cruelty. And the maid he barely noticed before was becoming the only kind soul left in the house. The Okoye mansion was unusually quiet that evening. The sun had already disappeared beyond the Lagos skyline, leaving behind a deep orange glow fading slowly into the darkening sky. Outside, the tall palm trees swayed gently in the cool evening breeze. Inside the house, the silence felt heavy. Adrian sat alone in the living room, his wheelchair positioned near the large window that overlooked the garden. The faint sound of crickets drifted through the slightly open balcony door. The mansion that once hosted glamorous parties and business meetings now felt almost empty. But Adrian did not mind the silence. What troubled him was the growing weight inside his chest. Over the past week, Vanessa's behavior had changed completely. She no longer pretended to care. She no longer hid her impatience. Kelvin now visited the house almost every day, and neither of them seemed bothered by Adrian's presence. Sometimes they laughed loudly while sitting just a few feet away from him. Sometimes they whispered to each other and kissed openly in the living room. And sometimes they spoke about Adrian as if he were not even there. To them, he had become invisible, a useless man in a wheelchair. But Adrian remained calm. Every insult, every careless word, every cruel action, all of it was simply evidence. Evidence that his decision to test Vanessa had been the right one. Still, there were moments when the betrayal stung more than he expected. Tonight was one of those moments. Adrian stared quietly at the dark garden outside. Then he heard soft footsteps approaching. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Sir." Ada's gentle voice filled the room. Adrian turned his wheelchair slightly. She stood near the doorway holding a tray. "Dinner is ready," she said with a small smile. Adrian nodded. "Thank you, Ada." She walked toward him and placed the tray carefully on the table. The smell of freshly cooked food filled the room. Rice, grilled chicken, vegetables. Ada noticed Adrian studying the plate. "I hope you like it," she said shyly. "I tried a new recipe." Adrian smiled faintly. "It smells good." Ada hesitated before asking, "Would you like help eating?" Adrian nodded slowly. "Yes, please." She pulled a chair beside him and gently lifted the plate. As she began feeding him, Adrian noticed how careful she was. She always made sure the food wasn't too hot. She waited patiently between each bite. She never rushed. It was such a small act of kindness. But in a house filled with coldness and betrayal, it meant more than she probably realized. For a few minutes they remained silent. Then Ada spoke quietly. "You've been very quiet today." Adrian gave a small smile. "I'm usually quiet." She shook her head. "Not like this." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "You've been observing me?" Ada laughed softly. "Only a little." Adrian leaned back slightly. "And what have you observed?" Ada thought for a moment. You look sad. Adrian didn't respond immediately. The word lingered in the air. Sad. Was that what he felt? Perhaps. But it was more complicated than that. Finally, he sighed softly. Ada? Can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you kind to someone like me? Ada looked confused. What do you mean? Adrian gestured toward the wheelchair. I'm a burden in this house. Her expression changed instantly. No. Her voice was firm. You're not a burden. Adrian gave a bitter smile. Vanessa seems to think otherwise. Ada hesitated. She had clearly noticed Vanessa's behavior, but she didn't want to speak badly about her employer. People sometimes behave differently when life changes suddenly, she said carefully. Adrian chuckled quietly. That's a polite way of saying people reveal their true selves. Ada looked down at the plate for a moment before continuing to feed him. After a few minutes, Adrian spoke again. Does it make you uncomfortable? What? Taking care of someone who can't walk? Ada immediately shook her head. No. Why not? She shrugged slightly. Because you're still a human being. Adrian looked at her carefully. Many people don't see it that way. Ada's voice softened. I do. The sincerity in her words made Adrian's chest tighten slightly. For days he had been treated like an inconvenience. But Ada's simple kindness reminded him that dignity still existed. After finishing the meal, she wiped his hands gently with a warm cloth. Then she stood up to take the tray. But Adrian stopped her. Ada. She turned. Yes, sir. Sit for a moment. She looked surprised. Are you sure? Yes. She hesitated briefly before sitting down in the chair beside him. For a moment they simply listened to the quiet sounds of the evening. Then Adrian asked, Do you ever get tired? Ada smiled faintly. Of working? Yes. Sometimes. She leaned back slightly. But life has never been easy for me. Adrian remembered the story she had shared about losing her parents. You mentioned your grandmother raised you. Ada nodded. She did. What happened to her? Ada's smile faded slightly. She passed away 3 years ago. Adrian felt a quiet sadness in his chest. I'm sorry. Ada shrugged gently. She was old. She had been sick for a long time. Adrian studied her face. Was she the one who taught you to be kind? Ada laughed softly. Yes. She always said something interesting. What? She said the way people treat those who can do nothing for them reveals their true character. Adrian felt a strange chill, because that was exactly what his test was revealing. He looked at Ada carefully. You believe that? Yes. She smiled gently. That's why I try to treat everyone well. Adrian asked quietly, Even someone who has lost everything? Ada looked directly at him. Especially someone who has lost everything. Her words hit him harder than she could imagine. For the first time since the test began, Adrian felt something warm break through the cold disappointment in his heart. He realized something important in that moment. Vanessa had been with him for 2 years. But he had never heard words as sincere as the ones Ada had spoken tonight. He slowly looked away toward the garden again. Ada. Yes. Have you ever been in love? The question caught her off guard. Her cheeks turned slightly red. No. Adrian smiled faintly. Never. She shook her head. I've always been too busy trying to survive. Adrian nodded slowly. That makes sense. Ada glanced at him curiously. Why did you ask? Adrian thought for a moment. Then he said quietly, Because sometimes people confuse love with convenience. Ada tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Adrian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply stared out into the dark garden. Then he spoke softly. Real love is supposed to stay, even when life becomes difficult. Ada nodded slowly. Yes. She paused before adding, My grandmother used to say real love is proven during hard times. Adrian looked at her again. And what if someone fails that test? Ada thought carefully. Then she replied, Then it wasn't real love. The words hung quietly between them. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Ada suddenly stood up. I should finish cleaning the kitchen. Adrian nodded. All right. She picked up the tray and walked toward the hallway. But before disappearing, she turned back. Good night, sir. Good night, Ada. As her footsteps faded into the distance, Adrian leaned back in his wheelchair. His heart felt strangely different tonight, still heavy with betrayal, but also touched by something unexpected. Hope, because in a house where cruelty had begun to dominate, one quiet maid had shown him the simple power of kindness. And Adrian was beginning to realize something important. Sometimes the most valuable people in life were the ones the world barely noticed. The night air outside the Okoye mansion was cool and quiet. Dark clouds had gathered in the sky, and the distant rumble of thunder rolled softly over the city of Lagos. A light rain had begun to fall, tapping gently against the large windows of the mansion. Inside, the house felt peaceful for the first time in days. Vanessa had gone out again earlier that evening. Adrian hadn't even asked where she was going. He already knew the answer. Kelvin. The man had become a regular visitor now. Sometimes he arrived in the afternoon. Sometimes at night. Sometimes he stayed so long that Adrian wondered if Vanessa even remembered she had a fiancé living in the same house. But strangely, Adrian felt less angry about it now. The truth had already revealed itself. Vanessa had failed the test, and every new act of cruelty simply confirmed what Adrian already knew. Still, despite the betrayal, something else had begun to grow quietly inside the mansion. Something Adrian had not expected. Peace. And that peace had a name. Ada. Adrian sat in the living room near the window, watching the rain fall across the garden. The soft sound of water hitting the ground created a calm rhythm that filled the quiet house. For a moment he allowed himself to relax. Then he heard footsteps approaching. Ada appeared in the doorway holding a tray. "Sir," she said gently, "I brought some tea." Adrian turned toward her and smiled faintly. "You seem to know exactly when I need tea." Ada laughed softly. "My grandmother used to say tea solves half of life's problems." Adrian chuckled. "I wish that were true." She placed the tray on the small table beside him. Steam rose gently from the cup. Ada noticed Adrian staring at the rain outside. "It's a peaceful night," she said. "Yes," Adrian replied quietly. "The rain makes everything feel calmer." Ada nodded. "I like rain." "Why?" "It reminds me of my village." Adrian looked at her curiously. "You grew up in a village?" "Yes." "Where?" "In Enugu State." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "That's far from Lagos." Ada nodded. "Very far." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "But sometimes I still miss it." Adrian leaned back slightly in his wheelchair. "What was it like growing up there?" Ada smiled faintly, as if memories had suddenly come alive in her mind. "It was simple." She sat down in the chair across from him. "There were farms everywhere. My father worked as a mechanic in the nearby town. But when he came home he always helped my mother in the small garden behind our house." Adrian listened carefully. "My mother sold vegetables in the local market," Ada continued. "She woke up very early every morning." "What about you?" Adrian asked. "I helped her sometimes, but my favorite place was the river." "The river?" Ada nodded. "There was a small river near our house. My friends and I used to swim there after school." She laughed softly. "We thought the world was so big back then." Adrian smiled. "And now?" Ada looked around the large mansion quietly. "Now the world feels complicated." Adrian understood that feeling very well. For a moment the only sound in the room was the rain tapping gently against the windows. Then Adrian spoke again. "You told me your parents died when you were 14. Ada nodded slowly. "Yes." Her smile faded. "It happened very suddenly." Adrian noticed her fingers tightening slightly in her lap. "The bus they were traveling in lost control on the highway," she continued quietly. "There were many passengers." She paused. "Only a few survived." Adrian felt a heavy sadness in his chest. "That must have been very difficult." Ada nodded. "It was." She looked down at the floor. "For a long time I felt like my whole world had disappeared." Adrian said nothing. He knew some pains didn't need immediate answers. After a moment Ada continued. "My grandmother took care of me after that. She sounds like a strong woman." "She was." Ada smiled slightly again. "She had very little money, but she had a big heart." "What did she do?" "She sold roasted corn by the roadside." Adrian looked surprised. "That can't make much money." Ada shook her head. "It didn't. But she always made sure I had food." "And school?" Adrian asked. Ada nodded proudly. "She insisted that I must continue my education." "What if you refused?" Adrian asked with a teasing smile. Ada laughed softly. "That was not an option." Adrian chuckled. "She sounds strict." "She was," Ada admitted. "But she always said something that stayed with me." "What was it?" Ada's voice became softer. She said kindness is the only wealth poor people can afford to give freely. Adrian felt something stir inside him. Kindness. The one thing Vanessa seemed incapable of offering anymore. My grandmother believed kindness always returns someday, Ada continued. That's why she never allowed me to hate anyone. Adrian looked at her thoughtfully. Even after losing your parents? Ada nodded slowly. Yes. She glanced toward the rain outside. For a long time I was angry at the world. What changed? My grandmother told me something one night. What? She said pain can either make a person bitter or compassionate. Adrian repeated the words quietly. Compassionate. Ada nodded. She told me if I allowed pain to make me bitter, I would lose the good parts of my heart. Adrian looked down at his hands resting on the wheelchair armrest. He wondered what kind of person he would have become if life had tested him the same way. You must miss her, he said softly. Ada nodded. Every day. They both sat quietly for a moment. Then Adrian asked something unexpected. Ada, have you ever been treated badly because you were poor? She laughed quietly. Many times. But you still treat people kindly? Yes. Why? Ada looked at him with calm eyes. Because I know how painful it feels to be treated like nothing. Her words struck Adrian deeply. For the past few weeks, Vanessa had begun treating him exactly that way. Like nothing. Like someone who had become useless. But Ada had chosen a different path. Her pain had made her compassionate instead of cruel. Adrian suddenly realized something. Kindness was not something people showed when life was easy. Kindness was something people showed when life was hard. And Ada had faced hardship far greater than most people in the mansion ever could. The rain outside began falling harder now. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Ada stood up slowly. I should go finish cleaning before the rain gets worse. Adrian nodded. Thank you for the tea. She smiled. You're welcome. But before leaving, she hesitated. Then she asked softly, Sir, can I ask you something? Adrian raised an eyebrow. Of course. Ada looked slightly nervous. Do you ever regret becoming so successful? The question surprised him. Why would you ask that? Ada shrugged gently. Sometimes people with a lot of money seem very lonely. Adrian thought about the question carefully. Then he answered honestly. Success didn't make me lonely. What did? Adrian looked toward the dark window. Not knowing who truly cares about me. Ada seemed to understand immediately. That must be difficult. It is. He paused before adding quietly. That's why people sometimes test those around them. Ada nodded slowly. That makes sense. But then she said something that made Adrian look at her again. Tests can reveal truth. But they can also reveal pain. Adrian smiled faintly. That's the risk. Ada gave him a gentle look. I hope the truth you discover brings you peace. Adrian watched her walk toward the hallway. And for the first time since the test began, he felt something surprising. Hope. Because while Vanessa had shown him the worst side of love, Ada had shown him the purest. And Adrian was beginning to realize that sometimes the person who changes your life forever is the one you least expect. Morning arrived slowly at the Okoye mansion. The sun rose behind a blanket of soft gray clouds, casting a pale light across the wide gardens and tall palm trees that surrounded the estate. Normally the mansion would feel calm in the morning hours, but today the atmosphere felt tense. Inside the house, Adrian sat in the living room near the large glass windows, staring out at the quiet garden. But his mind was not on the view. For weeks he had watched Vanessa's behavior grow worse and worse. At first it had been small things. Her impatience, her cold tone, her sudden lack of concern. Then Kelvin began visiting. Now Kelvin no longer bothered to hide his presence. Sometimes he arrived early in the morning. Sometimes he stayed late into the night. And Vanessa behaved as though Adrian simply did not exist. Adrian had created this test to reveal the truth. And now the truth had become impossible to ignore. Vanessa had failed. Completely. But Adrian still remained silent. He wanted to see just how far she would go. Across the room, Ada quietly wiped the glass table with a soft cloth. She moved carefully, trying not to disturb Adrian's thoughts. But she could sense the tension in the room. Over the past few weeks she had noticed everything. Vanessa's cruel words. Kelvin's mocking laughter. The way they behaved as though Adrian was invisible. Ada did not understand how anyone could treat another human being that way. She glanced toward Adrian. He was staring outside again. His face looked calm, But Ada had learned that calm did not always mean peace. "Sir," she said gently. Adrian turned his wheelchair slightly. "Yes, Ada? I made breakfast. Would you like to eat now?" Adrian nodded slowly. "Yes, thank you." She brought the tray and placed it on the table beside him. Rice and eggs, fresh fruit, tea, simple but warm. As she began feeding him, Ada spoke softly. "You didn't sleep much last night." Adrian gave a small smile. "You're very observant." Ada shrugged. "It's easy to notice when someone is thinking too much." Adrian looked down at the plate. Sometimes thinking is unavoidable. Ada did not ask further. She simply continued feeding him quietly. Suddenly, loud laughter echoed from upstairs. Ada froze slightly. Adrian's eyes lifted slowly toward the staircase. Footsteps followed. Then Vanessa's voice filled the house. "Kelvin, you're impossible." Ada's face tightened. Moments later, Vanessa and Kelvin walked down the stairs together. Vanessa wore a short silk robe. Kelvin had his arm casually draped around her shoulders. They both stopped when they saw Adrian and Ada in the living room. Kelvin smirked. "Well, good morning." Vanessa barely looked at Adrian. Instead, she walked straight toward the kitchen. "Do we have coffee?" she asked loudly. Ada stood up. "Yes, ma'am. I'll prepare some." Kelvin sat down on the couch and stretched lazily. He glanced toward Adrian. "You're always in the same place." Adrian said nothing. Kelvin chuckled. "I guess you don't have many options." Vanessa returned a moment later. She sat beside Kelvin and leaned against him comfortably. Ada walked past them with the coffee tray. As she placed the cups on the table, she could feel the tension building. Kelvin suddenly wrapped his arm tighter around Vanessa's waist. "You look beautiful this morning," he said. Vanessa laughed softly. "Stop." Kelvin leaned closer. "I'm serious." Then he kissed her. Right there. In the middle of the living room. Right in front of Adrian. Ada froze. The cloth she was holding slipped slightly from her hands. Her eyes widened with shock. Vanessa didn't seem to care. She kissed Kelvin back openly. When they finally pulled apart, Kelvin laughed. "Oops." He glanced toward Adrian. "Did we disturb you?" Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Relax. He can't do anything." The words landed heavily in the room. Ada felt anger rise inside her chest. She had tried to stay quiet, tried to mind her own business. But what she was seeing now felt deeply wrong. Kelvin leaned back comfortably. "So Vanessa," he said casually, "when are you finally leaving this place?" Vanessa shrugged. "Soon." Kelvin raised an eyebrow. "What's taking so long?" Vanessa glanced toward Adrian. "Legal things." She said the words as if Adrian were an object in the room, not a person. Ada could no longer stay silent. "How can you do this?" she said suddenly. The room went completely quiet. Vanessa turned slowly toward her. "What did you say?" Ada stood straight. Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't look away. "How can you treat him like this?" Kelvin laughed loudly. "Oh look, the maid has an opinion." Vanessa's face darkened. "Mind your business," she snapped. Ada shook her head. "He is your fiancé." Vanessa stood up abruptly. "And?" Ada's eyes filled with emotion. "He is injured. He needs care." Vanessa laughed coldly. "He's a cripple." Ada's heart pounded. "That doesn't mean he deserves to be humiliated." Kelvin stood up now, clearly amused by the argument. "Wow, this is entertaining." Vanessa walked closer to Ada. "You're just a maid," she said sharply. "Know your place." Ada's hands trembled slightly, but she didn't move. "Kindness has no rank," she replied quietly. Vanessa scoffed. "Oh please." She turned back toward Kelvin. "Let's go upstairs." Kelvin nodded. "Good idea." But before they moved, Kelvin leaned toward Adrian and smirked. "You're lucky to have such a loyal maid." Vanessa laughed again. "Yes. She cares more about him than I ever did." They both laughed. Then they walked upstairs together, their laughter echoing through the house. Silence returned to the living room. Ada stood frozen in place. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Adrian watched her quietly. Finally he spoke. "Ada." She turned quickly. "I'm sorry, sir. I shouldn't have spoken like that." Adrian shook his head slowly. "You were defending someone who couldn't defend himself." Ada looked down. "But it's not my place." Adrian studied her face. "It takes courage to stand up against cruelty." Ada's eyes filled with tears. "I just couldn't watch anymore." Adrian felt a deep warmth in his chest. In a house where everyone treated him like nothing, this young woman had risked her job just to defend his dignity. "Ada," he said gently. "Yes. Thank you." She wiped her eyes quickly. "You don't deserve that kind of treatment." Adrian sighed softly. "No, I don't." But inside his mind, something had finally shifted. Vanessa had crossed the final line, the breaking point. She had humiliated him openly, mocked his condition, and now even the staff had been forced to witness her cruelty. Adrian looked toward the staircase where Vanessa had disappeared. For weeks he had allowed the test to continue. But now the truth was undeniable. The test was over, and soon, Vanessa would learn that the man she believed powerless was still the most powerful person in that house. The Okoye mansion was unusually quiet that morning. The rain from the previous night had washed the air clean, leaving the gardens outside fresh and bright under the early sunlight. Birds chirped softly among the palm trees, and the fountain in the courtyard sparkled as the light reflected off the flowing water. But inside the mansion, Adrian Okoye sat silently in his wheelchair, deep in thought. The events of the previous day had finally pushed him to a decision. For weeks he had watched Vanessa slowly reveal her true nature. He had endured the insults, the humiliation, the betrayal. First it had been painful, but eventually, the pain turned into clarity. The test he had created had served its purpose. Vanessa had failed, completely, and Adrian was no longer interested in pretending to be powerless. This morning, the truth would begin to unfold. Adrian looked down at the phone in his hand. He had been staring at the screen for several minutes, thinking carefully. Once he made this call, everything would change. The test would end. Vanessa's world would collapse, and the woman who believed she had been mocking a helpless cripple would suddenly realize the truth. Adrian finally pressed the call button. The line rang only once. "Good morning, sir." Samuel's calm voice answered immediately. Samuel had been Adrian's most trusted assistant for nearly a decade. While the world believed Adrian had lost control of his empire, Samuel had secretly been managing everything behind the scenes. "Good morning, Samuel," Adrian replied quietly. "Is everything all right?" Adrian glanced toward the staircase. The house was still quiet. "Yes," he said calmly. "The test is over." Samuel paused briefly. "I see." Adrian could almost hear the understanding in his assistant's voice. "So it didn't go well," Samuel said gently. Adrian let out a slow breath. "Not even close." Samuel remained silent for a moment. "I'm sorry, sir." Adrian shrugged slightly, even though Samuel couldn't see him. "It's better to know the truth now than after a wedding." "That's true," Samuel replied. Adrian leaned back in the wheelchair. "I want everything ready today." "You mean, the reveal?" "Yes." Samuel's tone became serious. "I'll inform the lawyers and the executive team immediately." Adrian nodded. "Bring the documents. And the cars." Samuel understood instantly. "Understood, sir." Adrian ended the call. For a moment he sat quietly, staring out the window. Today the mask would come off. Today Vanessa would finally see the truth. The house remained quiet for another hour. Then the familiar sound of high heels echoed from the staircase. Vanessa appeared in the living room wearing an elegant silk dress. She looked refreshed and cheerful, very different from the irritated woman Adrian had grown used to seeing. Adrian noticed immediately. Something had changed in her mood. "Good morning," she said casually as she walked past him. Adrian looked at her. "Good morning." Vanessa stopped near the mirror and adjusted her hair. "You look unusually calm today," she said. Adrian smiled slightly. "Do I?" "Yes." She turned to face him. "Did something good happen?" Adrian's smile remained steady. "Something like that." Vanessa shrugged. "Well, that's nice." She grabbed her phone from the table. "I'm going out later today." "With Kelvin?" Adrian asked calmly. Vanessa froze for a moment. Then she rolled her eyes. "Of course." Adrian simply nodded. "I figured." Vanessa looked slightly annoyed. "Adrian, you've been acting strange lately." "How so?" "You're too calm." Adrian chuckled quietly. "I thought you preferred calm." Vanessa sighed. "Whatever." She walked toward the kitchen. Just then, the doorbell rang. Vanessa frowned. "Who's that?" Adrian glanced toward the door. "Probably visitors." Vanessa looked confused. "Visitors?" Ada walked from the hallway toward the door. "I'll check, ma'am." When she opened the door, she gasped slightly. Outside the mansion stood several men in dark suits. Behind them, 3 black luxury cars were parked neatly along the driveway. Ada looked confused. "Good morning," one of the men said politely. "We're here to see Mr. Adrian Okoye." Ada hesitated. "Please come in." Vanessa walked into the living room just as the men entered. Her eyes widened. "What's going on?" The men nodded respectfully toward Adrian. "Good morning, sir." Vanessa looked from them to Adrian. "What is this?" Adrian remained calm. "Business." Vanessa frowned. "Business?" One of the men stepped forward and placed a briefcase on the table. "We brought the documents you requested." Vanessa stared at the scene in confusion. "Adrian, what documents?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly placed his hands on the arms of the wheelchair. Then something happened that made the entire room freeze. Adrian stood up. Vanessa's eyes widened in pure shock. The glass she was holding slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble floor. "What?" Her voice echoed through the mansion. You can walk?" Ada gasped quietly near the doorway. The men in suits simply watched calmly. Adrian stretched his legs slowly, as if he had been sitting too long. Then he turned to face Vanessa. "Yes," he said calmly. "I can." Vanessa staggered backward. "But the accident." Adrian's expression turned cold. "There was no accident." The room fell silent. Vanessa's face went pale. "You're lying." Adrian shook his head. "No." He stepped closer. "I was never crippled." Vanessa's entire body began trembling. "But the hospital. Actors," Adrian replied calmly. "The medical reports? Fabricated. The news? Controlled." Vanessa stared at him as if she had seen a ghost. "You're saying all of this was fake?" Adrian nodded. "Yes." Ada stood frozen near the doorway, trying to process what she was hearing. Vanessa's voice became shaky. "Why?" Adrian looked directly into her eyes. "To test you." The words hit her like a thunderbolt. "Test me?" "Yes. To see if you loved me." Vanessa's lips trembled. "And now," she whispered. Adrian's voice was cold. "Now I know the truth." At that moment, another car pulled into the driveway outside. More men in suits entered the mansion. Lawyers, executives, people Vanessa recognized from Adrian's business empire. Her heart began pounding wildly. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The man she believed had lost everything, had never lost anything at all. And suddenly, the mansion that once felt like her future, was becoming a place where she no longer belonged. The silence inside the Okoye mansion felt heavier than thunder. Vanessa stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at Adrian. Just minutes ago, she believed she was living with a helpless man in a wheelchair. Cripple. A broken billionaire who had lost everything. But now that same man stood tall before her, strong and confident, with the calm authority that once made him one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. The shattered wine glass at her feet reflected the shock on her face. You can walk?" Vanessa whispered again, as if repeating the words might somehow make them false. Adrian looked down briefly at his legs before looking back at her. "Yes." His voice was calm, cold, controlled. "I was never crippled." Vanessa shook her head slowly. That doesn't make sense." She turned toward the men in suits standing around the room. The lawyers, the executives, Samuel, people she recognized from Adrian's company meetings before the accident. They all looked perfectly calm, as if nothing surprising had just happened. Vanessa's voice trembled. "Someone explain what is happening." No one spoke. Finally Adrian stepped forward. "This was a test." Vanessa's face twisted with confusion. "A test?" "Yes." Adrian's voice carried a quiet authority. "I needed to know whether the woman I planned to marry loved me." He paused. "Or my money." The words echoed through the large living room. Vanessa's breathing became uneven. "You faked an accident? Just to test me?" Adrian nodded slowly. "Yes." Vanessa laughed suddenly, but the laugh sounded nervous, unstable. "That's insane." Adrian remained silent. "You lie to everyone," she continued. "You made the whole world believe you were crippled." Adrian shrugged slightly. "That was necessary." Vanessa's eyes filled with anger. "Necessary?" "Yes. To see who would stay beside me when everything seemed lost." Vanessa's voice grew louder. "And you think this proves something?" Adrian looked directly into her eyes. It proves everything. The room became quiet again. Vanessa stared at him, waiting for something, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps an explanation that would somehow make the situation better. But Adrian's expression remained firm. You failed the test, Vanessa. The words hit her like a slap. Her mouth opened slowly. Failed. Adrian turned slightly and gestured toward the lawyers. One of them stepped forward and placed a stack of documents on the table. These are the records of the past few weeks, the lawyer explained calmly. Vanessa looked confused. What records? Adrian spoke again. The security cameras in this house never stopped recording. Vanessa's stomach dropped. Adrian continued calmly. Every conversation, every visit, every moment. Vanessa felt her legs weaken. No. Yes. Adrian's voice was quiet but merciless. I saw everything. Vanessa's mind raced. The kisses, the insults, the laughter. Kelvin. The realization struck her like lightning. You were watching? Adrian nodded. Every day. Vanessa's breathing became rapid. You tricked me. Adrian raised an eyebrow. No. I revealed the truth. Vanessa stepped closer to him. You manipulated everything. Adrian didn't move. All I did was remove the money. Vanessa's voice cracked. You made yourself look helpless. And you showed me exactly how you treat someone you believe is helpless. Vanessa's hands began shaking. You don't understand. Adrian's eyes hardened. Oh, I understand perfectly. He turned slightly toward the men standing nearby. Tell her. Samuel stepped forward calmly. Miss Vanessa, during the last 3 weeks, Mr. Okoye's companies have continued operating normally. Vanessa looked confused. What do you mean? Samuel spoke clearly. Mr. Okoye did not lose his wealth. The reports about frozen assets were false. Vanessa felt the ground shift beneath her. You're saying? Yes, Samuel replied. Mr. Okoye is still one of the richest men in the country. The words hit her like a wave. Vanessa's eyes widened in horror. The man she had mocked, the man she had betrayed, the man she had cheated on, was still the same billionaire she had always admired. And now, she had destroyed everything. Vanessa suddenly dropped to her knees. Adrian, please. Her voice broke. I made a mistake. Adrian looked down at her without emotion. A mistake? Yes. She grabbed his hand desperately. I didn't mean any of it. Adrian slowly pulled his hand away. You brought another man into my house. Vanessa shook her head wildly. That was nothing. You kissed him. It didn't mean anything. You laughed at me. Vanessa's tears streamed down her face. I was confused. Adrian's voice became colder. You called me a cripple. Vanessa's lips trembled. I didn't know. Adrian interrupted her. You said you would never marry a cripple. Vanessa buried her face in her hands. I didn't mean it. But Adrian's expression remained unchanged. Behind him, Ada stood quietly near the doorway, still trying to understand everything she had just witnessed. She had spent weeks believing Adrian was helpless. Now she realized the truth. The man she had been feeding and caring for was actually one of the most powerful men in the country. Vanessa lifted her tear-stained face again. Adrian, please. I love you. Adrian looked at her silently. For a moment the room held its breath. Then he spoke. No. The word was simple, but final. Vanessa's shoulders shook as she sobbed. Please don't do this. Adrian shook his head slowly. The man you loved was money. Vanessa crawled closer. That's not true. Adrian's eyes were steady. When you thought I lost everything, you lost interest. Vanessa's voice broke completely. I was scared. Adrian turned slightly away. You were selfish. Vanessa reached for him again. Please give me another chance. But Adrian stepped back. His voice became firm. The truth has already been revealed. The room fell silent once more. Vanessa remained on her knees, crying desperately. The powerful billionaire she once believed she controlled now stood before her like a judge delivering a final verdict. And deep inside her heart, she knew the worst part was not the humiliation. The worst part was realizing she had destroyed the one future she truly wanted. Because Adrian Okoye had not lost his wealth. He had only lost his faith in her. The Okoye mansion felt colder than it had ever been. The once luxurious living room, filled with expensive art, marble floors, and sparkling chandeliers, now carried a tense silence that pressed heavily on everyone inside. Vanessa remained on her knees in the center of the room. Her makeup had begun to run down her face, leaving faint dark lines beneath her eyes. Her hands trembled as she wiped away tears, but the crying would not stop. Everything she believed about her future had just collapsed. Adrian stood a few feet away, tall and calm. The same man she once admired. The same man she thought she could control. But now he looked completely different to her. Not weak, not broken, not helpless. Instead, he looked exactly like the powerful billionaire the world respected and feared. And the worst part was that he was looking at her with eyes that no longer held love, only finality. Behind Adrian, the lawyers and executives stood quietly, giving the couple space while still witnessing the moment. Ada remained near the doorway, her heart beating rapidly as she watched everything unfold. She had never imagined seeing something like this inside the house. Vanessa lifted her tearful face again. "Adrian, please." Her voice was hoarse from crying. "Don't do this." Adrian looked down at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke quietly. "It's already done." Vanessa shook her head desperately. "No, no, it's not." She crawled closer toward him. "You said you tested me." "Yes." "Then give me another chance." Adrian remained silent. Vanessa grabbed his hand again. "People make mistakes." Her voice trembled with desperation. "I was confused. I didn't understand what was happening." Adrian gently removed his hand. "You understood perfectly." Vanessa's eyes widened. "No." "Yes." Adrian's voice was calm but firm. "You understood that I had lost my wealth. You understood that I couldn't walk. And you decided I was no longer worth your time." Vanessa shook her head violently. "That's not true." Adrian looked at her steadily. "Then explain, Kelvin." Vanessa froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Adrian continued. "You brought him into this house. You kissed him in front of me. You laughed while he mocked me." Vanessa's tears flowed faster. "I wasn't thinking clearly." Adrian's voice grew colder. "You called me useless." Vanessa buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean it." Adrian shook his head slowly. "You said I was depressing." Vanessa sobbed harder. "Please." "You said you would never marry a cripple." Vanessa's shoulders trembled uncontrollably. "I was angry." Adrian took a deep breath. "For 3 weeks you treated me like a burden." Vanessa finally looked up again. Her voice was almost a whisper. "I was scared, Adrian." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Scared?" "Yes." Vanessa struggled to stand, using the nearby table for support. Her legs were shaking. "I thought everything was gone." Adrian watched her quietly. "My future. The life we planned, everything," she continued. "I didn't know how to handle it." Adrian crossed his arms. "So you replaced me?" Vanessa's lips trembled. "No." "Yes." Adrian's voice was final. "You replaced me with the first man who walked through the door." Vanessa looked toward the floor, unable to meet his eyes. For a moment the room was silent except for the sound of her uneven breathing. Finally she spoke again. "Adrian, please." Her voice was barely audible. "I still love you." Adrian stared at her. For a brief moment, the room felt like it was holding its breath. Then he shook his head. "No." The word cut through the silence like a blade. Vanessa's knees gave out again. She collapsed back onto the floor. "You can't mean that." Adrian's face remained calm. "I do." Vanessa looked around desperately at the men standing nearby. "Someone say something." No one moved. No one spoke. Samuel stepped forward slightly, but only to stand beside Adrian. Vanessa turned back toward Adrian. "You're throwing everything away because of one mistake." Adrian's expression hardened. "One mistake." He gestured toward the staircase. "You slept in the same bed with another man while I was in this house." Vanessa gasped. "That's not what happened." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "The cameras disagree." Vanessa's heart dropped. The cameras. She had forgotten about the cameras. Every moment, every kiss, every laugh, all recorded. Her voice broke completely. "Adrian, please don't humiliate me like this." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. "You humiliated yourself." The words shattered the last bit of hope Vanessa had been holding. Her crying became uncontrollable now. "I'm begging you." Adrian turned toward the security guards standing near the door. "Escort her out." Vanessa's head snapped up. "What?" Adrian didn't look at her again. "She no longer belongs here." Vanessa quickly stood up and rushed toward him. No! She grabbed his arm desperately. You can't throw me out. Adrian slowly removed her hand. I just did. Vanessa's voice turned desperate. Adrian, please. Where will I go? Adrian's face showed no emotion. That is no longer my concern. The guard stepped forward. Ma'am, please come with us. Vanessa backed away. No. She looked toward Ada suddenly. Ada. Ada froze. Vanessa rushed toward her. Tell him to stop this. Ada looked shocked. You saw everything. Vanessa cried. You know I didn't mean it. Ada's heart pounded. She felt sympathy for Vanessa's pain. But she also remembered every cruel word Vanessa had spoken. Every insult. Every humiliation. Ada lowered her eyes slightly. I'm sorry, ma'am. Vanessa stared at her in disbelief. You too. Ada said nothing. The guards gently grabbed Vanessa's arms. Ma'am, please. Vanessa struggled briefly, but the fight had already left her. Tears continued pouring down her face as they guided her toward the door. Just before reaching the entrance, she turned back one last time. Her eyes locked onto Adrian. You'll regret this, she cried. Adrian didn't respond. You think that Maid cares about you? Ada felt her heart stop for a moment. Vanessa pointed toward her angrily. She's just pretending. Adrian remained calm. Vanessa's voice became bitter. One day she'll betray you too. Adrian finally spoke. That's enough. The guards opened the door. Vanessa was led outside. Her crying echoed across the driveway as they escorted her toward the gate. Then the door closed. The sound echoed through the mansion like the final chapter of a long story ending. Silence filled the room once again. Adrian stood still for a moment. Then he let out a slow breath. The test was finally over. Samuel stepped closer. Are you all right, sir? Adrian nodded slowly. Yes. Samuel studied his face carefully. You made the right decision. Adrian looked toward the doorway where Vanessa had stood only moments before. Yes, he said quietly. I know. Across the room, Ada remained standing silently, unsure of what to say. The man she had cared for all this time, the man she believed was helpless, had just revealed himself to be someone completely different, and she wasn't sure how to feel. Adrian finally turned toward her. Their eyes met across the room. For the first time since the truth was revealed, neither of them spoke. But something had already begun to change between them, because sometimes the end of one story is the beginning of another, just peaceful. For weeks, tension had filled every room in the house. The sound of arguments, mocking laughter, and whispered betrayals had hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. But now that storm had passed. The doors had closed behind Vanessa, and with her departure, the cruelty and humiliation that had dominated the mansion seemed to vanish as well. Adrian stood near the large window in the living room, looking out over the gardens. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. Behind him, the executives and lawyers quietly gathered their documents. Samuel approached him calmly. Everything has been taken care of, sir. Adrian nodded. Good. Samuel hesitated before speaking again. Are you certain you're all right? Adrian thought about the question for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Yes. Samuel studied him for a moment before giving a small approving smile. Then I'll return to the office and inform the board that everything is back to normal. Thank you, Samuel. Samuel turned to leave, but before stepping out he glanced toward Ada, who still stood quietly near the doorway. She looked overwhelmed. Understandably so. Samuel gave her a polite nod before leaving the mansion with the other men. A few minutes later the house became completely silent. Now only two people remained in the living room. Adrian and Ada. Ada stood nervously with her hands folded together. She had no idea what to say. Everything she believed about the past few weeks had suddenly changed. The man she had been feeding, the man she had helped move around the house, the man she thought had lost everything, was actually one of the most powerful men in the country. Ada looked down at the floor. Sir. Adrian turned toward her. You don't have to call me sir anymore. Ada blinked. I don't. Adrian smiled slightly. You've done more for me than most people in my life. Ada shook her head quickly. I was just doing my job. Adrian walked closer. No. He spoke gently. You were showing kindness. Ada didn't know how to respond. For weeks she had simply treated him the way she believed anyone deserved to be treated. But now that she knew the truth, everything felt different. I'm sorry if I ever did anything wrong. she said quietly. Adrian raised an eyebrow. Wrong. Ada nodded. I didn't know who you really were. Adrian chuckled softly. That was the point. Ada looked confused. You mean, you wanted everyone to believe you were poor and helpless? Yes. Ada hesitated. But why? Adrian sighed softly. Because I wanted to know who would still treat me like a human being. Ada's heart tightened slightly. And Vanessa? Adrian nodded slowly. She failed. Ada looked down. I'm sorry. Adrian shook his head. Don't be. His voice became calm again. The truth is better than a lie. They both stood in silence for a moment. Then Adrian spoke again. You know something interesting, Ada? What? During those weeks when I pretended to be crippled, Ada listened carefully. You were the only person in this house who never changed. Ada looked surprised. I didn't change because I didn't know anything had changed. Adrian smiled faintly. That's exactly why it mattered. Ada looked confused. Adrian continued. You spoke to me like I was still a person. You fed me without complaining. You defended me when Vanessa humiliated me. Ada remembered that moment clearly. Her cheeks turned slightly red. I shouldn't have spoken like that. Adrian shook his head. You showed courage. Ada didn't feel courageous. She had simply felt angry watching someone be treated so cruelly. Adrian stepped closer. You treated me with kindness when you believed I had nothing. Ada lowered her eyes. My grandmother always said kindness is free. Adrian smiled. She was right. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the room with a warm glow. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Adrian asked quietly, Ada, what do you plan to do now? Ada looked confused. What do you mean? Well, Adrian said thoughtfully, you no longer work for Vanessa. Ada blinked. That's true. And technically, Adrian continued, your job here was arranged by her. Ada felt her stomach drop slightly. She hadn't thought about that. Her voice became small. So, I should leave. Adrian quickly shook his head. No. Ada looked surprised. You can stay here as long as you want. Ada didn't know what to say. Thank you, she said softly. Adrian studied her carefully. Ada. Yes. What if I asked you something unusual? Ada hesitated. Like what? Adrian took a deep breath. For years I believed love was impossible. Ada looked at him curiously. Why? Because everyone who came close to me cared more about my money than about me. Ada remained silent. But when I pretended to lose everything, Adrian continued, you stayed exactly the same. Ada looked down at her hands. I didn't stay because of anything special. I stayed because someone needed help. Adrian smiled. That's exactly what makes it special. Ada felt her heart beating faster. She didn't understand where this conversation was going. Ada, Adrian said gently, do you believe love can grow from kindness? Ada thought carefully. Then she nodded. Yes. My grandmother used to say kindness is the seed of love. Adrian smiled. Your grandmother was a wise woman. Ada laughed softly. She was. Adrian looked directly at her. I think she would like what I'm about to say. Ada's heart skipped slightly. What is it? Adrian spoke calmly. Ada, I want to get to know you. Ada blinked in surprise. Me? Yes. But, I'm just a maid. Adrian shook his head. You're a woman who showed me real kindness. Ada felt overwhelmed. She had never imagined something like this happening. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, Adrian replied gently. Just think about it. Ada nodded slowly. I will. The Okoye mansion looked completely different. Music filled the garden. Beautiful decorations covered the trees. White flowers lined the walkway leading toward a large wedding stage. Guests from across the country had gathered to witness the celebration. Business leaders, politicians, friends. Everyone had come to attend the wedding of Adrian Okoye. But the bride was not the elegant socialite many expected. Instead, she was a young woman wearing a simple but beautiful white dress. Ada, the maid who had once quietly cleaned the floors of the mansion, now walked gracefully down the aisle. The guests whispered among themselves in amazement. But Adrian didn't hear them. His eyes were focused only on Ada. When she reached him, he smiled warmly. You look beautiful. Ada laughed softly. You're biased. Completely. The priest began the ceremony. As they exchanged vows, Adrian spoke quietly to her. You loved me when you thought I had nothing. Ada smiled gently. And I would have loved you even if that had been true. Adrian held her hands. For the first time in my life, I know what real love looks like. Ada's eyes sparkled. And what does it look like? Adrian smiled. It looks like kindness. The guests applauded as they exchanged rings. The former maid who had once quietly served meals in the kitchen officially became the wife of one of the most powerful billionaires in the country. But more importantly, she became the woman who had proven that true love is not measured by wealth. It is revealed by how someone treats you when the world believes you have nothing. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to this channel and tell us where you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.